Hi there, this is Margaret Byrd, and welcome to Color Quest, and welcome back to the Pacific Northwest here in the summer of 2023. Back in June, I was lucky enough to spend a month in the Netherlands, and I collected some hollyhock that grow just wild in the urban regions, and loved sharing a couple of different options on how you might use them. One thing I had hoped to do from that was to use the dye flowers after we did those two projects to see if I might be able to simply make a wonderful dye pot of hollyhock. I filmed some of it and brought home the piece that I dyed, but it needs a little more work. So today on Color Quest, let's take that hollyhock dyed fiber from the Netherlands and spice it up a little bit. Let's go. So one of the aspects of today's video that I want to highlight is this idea of repurposing. Now, if you recall, when we first collected the hollyhock, we did cut some from the plant itself, but we also collected all around the base of those hollyhock plants the petals and flower buds that had fallen to the ground after they had shared their beauty with the world. So there is a repurposing that was going on. Foraging those downed blooms allowed us to clean up the street and see what colors they might still have had within the flowers, and there was quite a bit of color. Using them in an ice dye method, we didn't have a lot of blooms, so we were limited in the pattern we could make, but we did get some really vivid color on that fiber. Now, I had a pretty strong feeling that by simply putting those blooms in ice and allowing that technique to happen, we weren't actually going to be using all of the dye, and therefore I wanted to throw those into a dye pot. And that's exactly what I did. What color do you think we're gonna get? Let's take a look. So how about that color? If you've been here for a while, you probably knew that a heated pot of hollyhock was going to bring about a more greenish hue than the vibrant colors of blue and pinks that we got in the ice dye method. Now, you noticed that I was using a Kumo wrapped fiber. I had actually wrapped that while I was traveling in Baja. You saw that video a few weeks ago where we used the sun to make an aloe vera dye and simply put a Kumo dyed fiber into that jar to travel around with us. We got a really nice design, and I happen to have one of those left. So I thought we'd do a really quick review of how to tie the Kumo. So in case you want to try it, if you don't feel like going back and watching that video from Baja, here's the 60-second version of how to tie Kumo. like about the Kumo is that it allows me an opportunity to have a pattern, but then I can also use the tips of what I've tied to add some additional color. What I'd like to do first, however, is deepen the hollyhock. So, although I'm growing hollyhock in my dye garden, I don't have any blooms ready, but Botanical Colors happened to save the day with a package of hollyhock that I've had since last summer. So let's make ourselves a quick pot of hollyhock dye from the flowers that I have. I'm not going to use a lot since my fiber is so light, and the dried hollyhock is very precious, but also very strong. I will make a small pot now. We'll get that fiber soaking again and plop it into the dye pot. Get hopefully a deeper, richer color. Remember that you can always dye more than once. If you want to try to A, use more of the exhaust dye to just grab as much of that color as possible, and B, to build up the color. And that's what we're going to do today first. So let's get that Kumo soaking and into the hollyhock dye. One quick traveler story I want to share with you. That fiber that you saw that I pulled out from the dye pot in the Netherlands was damp. I simply threw it in a bag because I had to catch a flight home. Now, I went via London and then back to Seattle, but the bag that fiber was in did not follow me. It went a different route, and about 2.5 to 3 weeks later, the bag showed up at my house. Luckily, the fiber wasn't too gross. It did have a little bit of mold, and there would be some spots of it still, but I rinsed it out. Let me show that fiber to you now so you can see what it looks like dried before we start the next step. So there you have it. The well-traveled Kumo tied fiber. You can see a little bit of mold spots, but all in all, it did okay. You can also see the lightness of it, and that's why I'm hoping today we might be able to darken it first with a secondary dip in the dye pot with some hollyhock. Look how potent that is. These have only been soaking in this water for about a minute, and the water's already turning that really beautiful purple color. So we'll let this stew for maybe an hour, and we will pop our fiber in. So this has been steeping for about 45 minutes. I'm not going to remove the flowers. I'm simply going to take my wet fiber that's been soaking, and I'm just gonna put it right inside. Let's let that stew for like an hour. Well, that color is coming along nicely. Hard to tell if it's getting darker. I think it is, because as you know, wet fiber dries lighter in the color spectrum. So I still think we're a little bit darker than we were before. It would be really strange if we weren't able to capture some more of that color from those dried hollyhock. I'm gonna make some iron water. I'm going to add the tips of our Kumo tie into the iron water. Now, iron will react to tannin. Hopefully we got some tannin in some of those flowers. I'm hoping that we'll have enough in the dyed fiber that it will interact with the iron and darken it. Iron is a great modifier for color as well as a mordant. So this is going to be giving us a little extra mordant hold onto the parts that go into the iron water. So let's make the iron water. I'm not going to make very much. I'm going to be using a fraction of an eighth of a teaspoon, like 32nd or something. And as I've said many times, working with iron, you're going to want to wear a mask if you're working with the ferrous sulfate powder, just so you don't ingest it, and gloves because it can stain You want to watch where the little bits of powder might float, because it also, if it comes into contact with anything that has tannin in it, like wood, for example, it will react and darken that. You're going to want to only use utensils that you use for iron only. No cooking, no dye stuff, just for iron. Once you start using it, it will start to get contaminated, and you don't want to pass on the iron in areas unless you want it to happen. So, no accidental iron contamination, please. And if you don't have iron powder at home, you can make rust water. It will have a very similar interaction, and although you can't measure it precisely, it's a nice way to be able to make something at home. So there is a video here about how to make homemade iron water, but basically it's rusty metal, some water and vinegar, and a couple weeks of time. So you can go back and watch that. I'm just going to use the ferrous sulfate powder that I have from Botanical Colors. We're not getting too much of a change in those tips on the iron water, which, you know, leads me to believe that it's not too high in tannin. So I had an idea that we might be able to do a pH shift. Since the iron isn't doing too terribly much, what do you say that we just quickly throw together an alkaline bath? I could go acidic with lemon or vinegar, but I'm going to put a tiny bit of soda ash, washing soda. You can use baking soda as well, and see if we might be able to shift it that way. It's always worth trying all these different things because you just never know. Let's give it a whirl. This washing soda, which is soda ash, is really strong in terms of alkaline. So I'm not going to need very much because I'm only going to make this teeny tiny little bowl. It has got hot water in it. We'll just add a little bit to here just to let it dissolve, and we'll see if that helps with pH shift. That's changing. It's becoming a little bit more green. So it looks like an alkaline shift is gonna work. Let me do the rest of the tips. Okay, let's unbind it and get it hung up to dry. So there you have it. Many different ways in which you can enhance a tie-dyed piece of fiber. This was particularly fun for me considering that it started out actually using the exhaust dye with a middle step of dried hollyhock in a dye pot, followed by not a great result with the iron and then the pH shift. So a few things I wanted to point out. There were things I could have done potentially to help with the iron shift. Number one is iron reacts with tannin. So if I had pre-treated or post-treated My Kumo tied fiber in a tannin bath allowed that to dry, set. Definitely I would have had a sharp contrast with iron. Secondly is I could have tried a shift on the acidic side to see what that would have brought about. I'm gonna guess it would have been a yellow. And maybe there was a combination between the alkaline shift that I did on top of that iron that also contributed. I have no idea. So much of this is experimentation. A few other things I could have done is I could have removed the rubber bands after the first soak, and that is the soak I did in the Netherlands, and then retied it. So I would have had different colors and different design elements when I did the secondary dye. It's always an option as well. So the point here is just that there are so many different things you can do along the way. It's fantastic to always keep trying, as you know, and experimenting. Should have thought about the pH shift, didn't. And that was what made a difference. So next week on Color Quest, we didn't get the hollyhock from my garden for this video, but next week I'd like to take you on a little garden tour so I can show you the dye plants that I'm growing in my garden this year, and we can look to start our August with some dye flower fun here in the Pacific Northwest. So have a great week. Remember, if you're loving life here at Color Quest, go ahead and subscribe, tell your friends, give it a thumbs up, and I have all kinds of things available within the description below. So go check out some of those links for some free content, as well as access to my shop where I'm selling some of the wonderful things that I like to make with natural color. All right, I will see you next Friday.